Welcome back, Chelsea fans, to another episode of the London is Blue podcast, your home for all things Chelsea FC. Nick, Dan, and myself cover all the match reviews from the latest Chelsea matches. We cover the team news and even throw you some exclusive interviews. Thank you already for being an awesome listener. And you know what? Let's jump right in.
Welcome back, Chelsea fans, to another episode of the London is Blue podcast. And this is a special edition. One, unfortunately, because we don't have Brandon here. He's off doing something. Begins with a W, ends with a orc. I think it's work. Right, terrible. Nick? That's what he's doing? Something like that?
Yeah, just flat out awful is what that is. But you know what? We had to bring in a heavy hitter. A guy who is probably our most requested guest ever on the show. Joe Tweeds. To fill in and bring Brandon's spirit along with us. How are you doing, Joe?
It's a lot of pressure. I'm great, guys, yeah.
We won't hold you to having to protect goalkeepers in the same way that he does, even when they've made awful decisions and he somehow comes up with a way to defend what they did.
Except for Alisson today, that was a howler. Whew.
Yeah, interesting goalkeeper. He's world class in every game that I haven't seen him play for Liverpool. So it's, yeah.
All right. So we are doing, and we talked about this in social media. If you don't follow us on social, at London Blue Pod on Instagram, Twitter, all the other wonderful platforms. But we are doing a special Winter Window Wonderland podcast series. And it's going to be a two-parter with our friend Joe on the show. And it's going to look at a couple different things going around the club right now. We want to look a little bit at the potential of a transfer ban, what that could mean, why FIFA is looking at Chelsea for this particular issue or problem, kind of go into what the ramifications would be. Then in part two, so we're going to drop one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday. Part two is going to go through actual players, individual positions. Who would we sign? Who are we targeting? What we should be looking for? And it's going to be full of the Nick, Joe, and Dan show. But before we get any further than that, Nick, I think we're going to have a little ad from friends at Anchor.
That's right.
All right. So FIFA apparently is going to take Chelsea on with their transfer ban hammer. And this is going to potentially allow FIFA to deny the ability for Chelsea over a 2-window period from potentially signing any new players. And this kind of comes on the back of some of the Football Leaks information that has populated out. At this present time, there's not necessarily any suggestion that there's no decision that's been made, things of that nature. But ultimately, the punishment is in relation to, or reportedly in relation to, two things. One, the signing of Bertrand Traore from Burkina Faso before his 18th birthday, which would be a 1-window ban, and then signing additional U18 players, which would be a 3-window ban. And before we kind of get any further than that, I want to explain the whole kind of philosophy of why signing under 18 players is seen as such a major violation in the eyes of FIFA, because that's the individual who would be handing Chelsea the ban and the inability to sign players or register players. So Article 19 is the specific article that would be found in violation of potentially, and kind of looking at some of the law, and we are not lawyers like our friend Jay Cohen, but we're going to do our best, is that essentially there's an exemption for U18 players that would be they can be signed under the age of 18. However, they have to guarantee that the player will have an academic, school, vocational education, training in addition to football education and or training, which will allow the player to pursue a career other than football and should cease playing professional football. So, this was actually recently used and employed when Jadon Sancho was transferring from Manchester City to Borussia Dortmund, and it took longer to be signed because FIFA were investigating to make sure that this held water, that their commitment to this article was actually going to be met. So, Nick, I know this is obviously a lot. It's obviously concerning, and I think we've seen this in, American sports, in colleges, right? You can't go just sign a player and then give him a bunch of money and then hope that he, takes the Escalade and goes to your school, right? Like, that's not allowed.
Yeah, I guess you can if you're Louisville. You just can't get caught. I think that's the scenario. I mean, it is kind of like that. You're getting into, at least if you're thinking about the United States, you're getting into kind of child labor laws and things you can do before you're legally an adult. So there's a lot of decision making that I think FIFA has to consider when thinking about transferring players who admittedly can be, full professionals at a young age, but making sure that they still have all the ability afforded to them to pursue other things like school or vocational training. So I think it's all good there. FIFA's statement in regard to this essentially reads as the following. As communicated in September 2017, investigations were opened concerning the club Chelsea FC as well as other English clubs in relation to potential breaches of the regulations of status and transfer of players. The proceedings are ongoing, and to date, no decision has been passed by the FIFA judicial bodies. Thus, the clubs are presumed to be innocent unless decided otherwise. No further information can be provided as these cases are ongoing. Any update will be communicated in due course. So, Joe, that says a lot without saying anything. What are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I suppose, this concept of signing under 18 players is something which is kind of plagued not just Chelsea but Premier League clubs for a very long period of time. And you think of, I'm looking at Manchester City today and Chelsea maybe from 2010 onwards, the number of overseas youngsters that they signed. What sort of conditions that they would have to have come up with to parents and to the kind of other club and to the player themselves, as you say. If you are moving someone's entire family over at 15, 16, pretty much the kind of only focus is going to be on football. And I think, as you mentioned, you have to still be able to provide them with the ability to have these kind of vocational careers or academic pursuits, etc. It shouldn't just be for the sole focus of playing football for Chelsea. And I think, obviously, not just for Chelsea, but any Premier League club, if you're bringing someone in from France or Germany or Holland or wherever, the focus is going to be on trying to develop them as first-team footballers for Chelsea. So this kind of practice, has been going for a long period of time, and it's not uncommon for clubs. And then this is, again, no particular names or fingers mentioned here. Sort of signing parents in terms of giving them jobs, in terms of obviously providing academic places, in terms of fee-paying schools and things like that in the UK. So there's a lot of grey in this area, and I think particularly when you start to look at the Traore case, there is probably, from Chelsea's perspective, again, I mean, you will see probably from Chelsea's response in that they feel they've done nothing wrong here, that Traore was playing in trial matches, which obviously are not official matches. He hasn't played in any FA Youth Cup games or any under-18 league games, etc. So I think that's the club's kind of slightly tenuous defence, that he wasn't an official Chelsea player per se, in the same way that, I don't know, Lewis Baker, Loftus-Cheek, Chalobah, etc. were signed to contracts and youth team players playing in registered competitions. So with Traore, there was this kind of grey area that he was just a trialist. I think when I say it out aloud, it seems a little bit dubious that he would be on trial from 13 to 18. He obviously wasn't impressing them that much, but that's more of a tongue-in-cheek approach to it. But and it wouldn't just be Traore. I mean, obviously Chelsea have previous with the whole Gael Kakuta situation as well. So it's always kind of, I mean, we were always going to be, I suppose, the club that came under the spotlight if this ever became a significant sort of issue for FIFA and for any club in England, because we do have previous with this as well. And we have obviously signed some very high-profile youngsters, not just domestically, but also those from abroad. Andreas Christensen, Nathan Ake, Jeffrey Broom. I mean, a lot of these guys have gone on to become international footballers, and whether these guys have been signed above board, I think I'm not too sure on whether that's the case. But they have, most likely, I would say, if there are further under-18s being questioned, you could probably look at those who have been signed abroad by Chelsea in the past, I don't know, let's say 5 seasons. But it's another tricky situation that the club is going to have to navigate, obviously, with some slightly more unsavoury stuff that's happening around the club at the moment. This is a little bit more closer to the playing side of things. But I think the club are going to have to really try and, I wouldn't say weasel their way out of this, but they're really going to have to come up with some very, very strong arguments from a legal foundation, because, I would say particularly with the kind of the spate of contract renewals that we've seen, it doesn't take a genius to kind of figure out that the club are maybe gearing up for a potential transfer ban. How long that ban is, that's kind of anyone's guess at this point. But the fact that we've renewed so many players so quickly, we're offering contracts to maybe players who potentially in previous years Bayern may not have been offered contract extensions. Fabregas and maybe arguably someone like David Luiz, who's been offered an extension as well. I think that kind of has set the club stall up per se. And yeah, I expect the situation to get a lot messier before it's resolved.
So we'll take a look, as you talk about that, what Chelsea's defense was, or their statement is that the club has fully cooperated with FIFA and has provided comprehensive evidence demonstrating its compliance with the applicable FIFA regulations. We will not comment further on speculation concerning confidential contracts or player-related matters, which is pretty boilerplate legalese, I think, Nick, in a way of not talking about an ongoing investigation.
Yeah, exactly, and frankly, that's the right approach. I mean, you've seen cases where a party accused of something, doesn't kind of keep it above board, and that can influence the way that a case is handed down. So I think that's the only response that the club can really give at this point. I mean, I also read FIFA's statement earlier that, innocent until proven guilty. So, I think they are, everyone's kind of treading lightly right now to ensure that the facts are the things that determine the punishment or lack thereof, and instead of other outside influences, Dan.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple potential outcomes that we should go through here. One is that Chelsea's deemed to not be in violation of any said claims or receives no punishment for any of the allegations that are being leveled against the club, which would be the perfect world scenario. Though I think if we just look outside any of our windows, we probably would agree that the world is not perfect. So let's kind of go on to darker timelines. And it goes from light gray to absolutely dark of space, devoid of oxygen, and our lungs are going to implode upon themselves. So one being that Chelsea deemed to be guilty for signing just Traore ahead of his 18th birthday when he was on trial from 13 to 18, and the club could be issued a transfer ban for one window, which would be unfortunate, but it happens to clubs, and it's something that we would find a way to work around. Chelsea could also be deemed to be guilty maybe just for the signing of additional U18 players, and that we get issued a multi-year ban or a multi-window ban, or the absolutely death of space. Chelsea is deemed to be guilty for both claims, and then the club is issued a 4-window 2-year transfer ban. And Joe, just kind of from a feeling standpoint, with the rate of renewals, with the names we're seeing linked to very young players, the Kepa contract being very long, which obviously has to do a little bit with the amortization of the wage too. Do we think we knew about this for a long time coming, or do we think we were kind of surprised in the past 6 months around this? This feels like it's a longer term problem we've been trying to solve on the back end.
I think it's something that the club have probably known about for maybe a year to 2 years in terms of the investigation, but perhaps the readiness to issue the ban, maybe there's been some communication over, let's say, the past couple of months that has possibly kind of forced Chelsea's hands in some respects. I think just with as we've seen, this huge spate of renewals and contracts being sort of tendered to players, that suggests, I would say the club are maybe looking at a 3, even the whole 4 window potentially ban there. It's both the profile of the young players that we seem to be going after, obviously heavily linked with Christian Pulisic at the moment, and other players seem to be kind of around that age as well. We've also seen a bit more of a commitment, I'd say, in the past couple of months for Sarri to play Hudson-Odoi and Ampadu and Loftus-Cheek, and some of the younger players are getting a little bit more game time. So, if I was having my sort of slightly cynical and maybe my slightly more analytical hat on, I think with recent developments, I would say the club potentially are expecting to have let's say, an 18-month or 3 window, potentially even a 4-window ban. And, we're not a particularly well-liked club. I think that also comes into play, and that's often a badge that we kind of wear with pride at times. But I think some of the kind of stigma around Chelsea, particularly because we do have previous with this, I don't think that's going to count in our favour. So yes, obviously we've had this instance with Traore. They're also citing other under-18 players, but we also have this Gal Kakuta case fairly prominent hanging over heads. We had the Ashley Cole incident as well. some rumours about Rio Ferdinand eating in the same restaurant as a Chelsea chief executive at the time. There's lots of stuff that I don't think is necessarily going to contribute to us having a, not going to say a fair hearing, but if you expect him to go in with a clean slate and maybe have a slightly more lenient approach or a slightly more lenient sentencing, I don't think we're at that point. So yeah, I mean, I think that they are looking at a 3 to 4 window ban.
So Joe, in this case, no one likes us, but we kind of care.
I was going to say, it's like when the minor has a rap sheet and it's supposed to be suppressed by the court, and then eventually they become an adult and they should be tried as adults. Yeah, our whole minor case history has followed us into this court. Our
priors are definitely going to affect this, and also, I mean, I think the Real Madrid thing and Atletico Madrid, I know we can touch on them a bit sort of later, but they were really kind of the first high-profile incidents that they had as a club, and we have this Premier League points deduction hanging over. I don't know if it's lapsed from the Ashley Cole incident and obviously the Gal Kakuta stuff. They're two very high-profile cases that these clubs I don't think had in the same way. And also, I would say again that if they are charging us with not just the Bertrand Traore transfer, but also if they are saying that it's multiple under-18s, then I think they have quite a bit of evidence to suggest that that's the case, which is also quite worrying.
So, yeah, I think that's a good transition point here. So we should take a look at what's happened to other large clubs. And, I mean, you don't have to look too far back to see both Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid, basically at the same time, were issued transfer bans by FIFA in January 2016. So it was mid-window. It hit, and they said, hey, by the way, next summer, you are not signing players, so go forward and try to figure out what's going to happen, because for a year, you're not going to do anything. Like, use this last 2 weeks in the window and sign somebody. So Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid both appealed to the Court of Arbitration of Sport. Real Madrid had a reduced ban in December 2016, so they were able to re-enter the transfer market in December 2017. Atletico Madrid was not able to have their appeal seen and overturned, and they actually had to serve the full ban, so they were not just able to sign anybody until January of 2017 or register anybody. That's why Costa went, and then he couldn't actually play for Atletico Madrid until he was able to be registered in that winter window. So it's not just, Nick, the small fish in the pond who are being targeted by FIFA or where FIFA are looking for these issues to pop up. This is something that pops up on the radar because I think also the connection with massive clubs doing something that they don't appreciate.
Right, and I think one of the things that probably isn't talked about in regard to some of these bans and things like that, not only around financial fair play, which is a whole different deal, but certainly around issues like these, is that FIFA was in 2014, 15, and 16 essentially raided and had all their skeletons, at least a lot of their skeletons, revealed, Sepp Blatter in particular. So I think FIFA is trying to show that they are a little bit more transparent now, that they're everyone should be playing by the same rules. And if Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid, among others, are being targeted, then you can kind of follow that logic pattern and think that your Chelseas, your Uniteds, your Liverpools, anyone, big clubs, Spurs not included, obviously, will be targeted at some point. And I think, Joe, that seems like it's happening more frequently now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the FIFA thing is a really good point. I think it's a general push for the governing bodies to be a lot more kind of above board with these incidents. And I think actually, even if you look at slightly closer to home, you have a lot of league football teams, so Brentford being a very good example, who are actually shutting down their all of their academy setup from under 18s below, primarily because of the poaching of young players. So, if you couldn't, for example, let's say we couldn't poach Ethan Ampadu from Exeter, is a very good example for until he was 18, 19, or whatever the age is going to be. Dele Alli might not have been able to move, etc. Actually, he might have moved a bit later than 18, but there's a lot of good examples of particularly young English players leaving their kind of football league or championship club to go to a Premier League team at sort of 14, 15, 16. never really kind of getting the opportunities that they should have, and then sort of fading slightly into obscurity. So, these kind of things are also, I think, would quite drastically affect the English game as well. If there was not a blanket ban potentially on sort of pulling in under 18s, obviously, they should be able to pursue the best footballing education they can. They should be able to get the best coaching, etc. But it would be a very interesting spin on things if domestically, Premier League clubs couldn't, for example, hoard some of this talent in their academies. But yeah, I think it's probably a general trend with FIFA that they are going to start trying to sort of be a lot more transparent, really going to try and crack down on some of these practices that people find quite unsavoury. And as usual, I mean, it's as we've seen for this this sort of season and the past couple of weeks, it's obviously never too far away from controversy. And it's one of these things. I think as a club, we probably do stretch the boundaries, and we're definitely not the only Premier League team to do this in terms of when it comes to sort of generating kind of talent in the academies, etc. But yeah, I mean, it looks potentially like we will be one of the clubs that gets an example made out of them. If it's a 2-window ban, a 2-year ban, I should say, sorry, then I think that's obviously going to have huge effects on us. But I think that the club will try and push for as lenient approach as possible. But yeah, I mean, kind of as we've discussed, I think the priors are potentially are going to count against us, and maybe it pushes the club to I don't want to say clean up their act, because I think that it's kind of a problem that's quite rife in European football anyway. But it kind of changes the way that they try and tackle some of these things, particularly when it comes to signing young players.
I think it's important to note too that FIFA is going after a lot of big clubs in multiple ways. It's not just Chelsea who are being targeted for these U18s or Bertrand Traore. Manchester City's being investigated for potential violations or pretty legitimate looking violations of financial fair play, and basically a legalized form of money laundering, which is pretty exciting and is going to be a really, really great novelization. I'm looking forward to the how they embed somebody to do that story, not just in the Pep locker room kind of scenario when they win the title. I'm really looking forward to that. That will be great video on demand. But ultimately, FIFA is going to target anything, and it's not that Chelsea are being singled out. It's just if we have potentially done something that is not in line with the letter of the law, we should expect to be appropriately punished for it, and then have to figure out how we work forward from that. And Nick, it may be a multi-window ban, which would not be great, but if we did the time, we should do the crime as up into what our lawyers can talk it down from.
Right.
I love that last bit.
Yeah, that is very true. I think the most important scenario, and we can kind of end this part, is that let's pretend a ban happens and Joe's best guess is right, and it's 3 windows, which is a really lengthy amount of time when trying to stay competitive in Europe, and maybe having Hazard leave at some point. That's a pretty lengthy deal, and then maybe the Court of Arbitration of Sport knocks it down to 2 windows. There's still some wiggle room here. I mean, this isn't to say that any of this is a done deal, as we've previously stated, but there's still some time to figure out, I think, from a Chelsea perspective, legally what they can talk it down to, and then I think what we're going to get into next is in part 2 of this is what do we do with our current squad, and start to make some decisions, either preemptively or based on the information that we have to stay competitive.
And before we do that, we did have a couple questions from Patreon that we have to throw out here. So our friend Mark was asking, if we were going to Vegas and putting odds on the transfer ban, what are the odds we potentially, what would we get? Joe, what do you think we would get from an odds perspective?
I mean, this feels like an incredibly specific question, and that Mark potentially is going to do this. So, I mean, as a financial person who works in banking, I would qualify this with that. Do not take this as any kind of advice here. I mean, I would say I think the prospect of a ban is incredibly likely. Let's say I'd say 80% and above. How long that ban is the part that I'm unsure about. I'm almost positive that FIFA will find that the Traore signing has kind of broken some of these particular rules, and that in case will trigger a ban. Whether the club, as I said, can use this trialist argument for that length of time that he's been playing unofficially for Chelsea, I'm a little bit dubious about personally. But yeah, 80, maybe 90%. I think that there will be a ban, and I think that the club's actions in terms of, I think as we've discussed, a lot of the contract renewals and that kind of very, very quick succession of renewing sort of some of the more prominent squad members, some of the offers to Fabregas and Luiz, etc. I think that also tallies up that the club are kind of almost hedging themselves in terms of losing some players and locking some players up, obviously, during the course of a potential ban. So 80 to 90%, I would say, in terms of them getting a ban. But how long that will be, I'm a bit unsure of.
And a point to consider that we didn't necessarily go over: when Atletico Madrid and Real Madrid got hit with their bans in January of 2016, it took until December of 2016 for the Court of Arbitration of Sport to actually render a verdict on that. So keep in mind that if we do get hit with a transfer ban of some capacity and an 80-90% possibility, if we do appeal, it's not an immediate, oh, we're going to hear your case and it's going to happen overnight and we'll get it done and then we'll be able to sentence and determine what's happening, or we'll be able to overturn. It's going to be a pretty lengthy process, to the point that Joe made earlier, that this is probably something that the club has known about for multiple months, if not more than a year or more, that we've kind of been being investigated and this has been going on. So other question would be, which I think we can all answer very easily, if there is going to be no ban, or there's going to be a window, and if this is the last one for a while, how important will this be from Devin? And I would say, I think universally we're all going to say that it would be hugely important to get this window right if we were getting a ban.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing here is if it's a multi-window ban, it's whether Chelsea, let's say my hunch is correct, and it's the 3 windows. If it's 2 summers and a January, then I think we're in trouble. If it's a summer and 2 January, so January, summer, January, then I think we've got a little bit more leeway to sort of manoeuvre there. But if it is a summer, then the January, then the following summer, and I think that's obviously problematic. The amount of big deals that obviously happen in the summer compared to January, I think that's fairly obvious. So yeah, I mean the importance of getting this window correct, both in terms of, I would say, player sales, but also in terms of bringing in some new talent, and particularly a striker. I think if we have to put up with Alvaro Morata and Olivier Giroud for the next 2 years, without being able to pull anyone back in, maybe Batshuayi comes back, but then I think that's very problematic. So I think that January becomes, if it wasn't important then, it becomes incredibly important now, and particularly to solve the problem that is that we're very poor in terms of having goal scoring options in the squad. So I think that problem, if it wasn't a problem already, I think that becomes an enormous problem in January.
2 years, though, is a very long time to learn about the offsides rule, though. So that is the one positive that we could take from this. But before we kind of look at the current squad, I know, Nick, you wanted to talk about something pretty special with our friends at Classic Football Shirts.
Absolutely. So in September, we haven't released this information except for this week on the pods. In September, we broke our 1,000,000th all-time download, and we were super pumped about it, but we didn't really know how to celebrate it because it was just kind of a special moment for us. But essentially what we've done is work with Classic Football Shirts to give away a signed Cesar Azpilicueta shirt from the 14-15 title winning season. So that's really special, and we're super pumped that they were so gracious as to give us that shirt. So essentially what you're going to need to do to help us kind of celebrate this milestone is watch Instagram and Twitter for rules and everything. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Follow Classic Football Shirts on Instagram and Twitter. That's kind of an entry point. Comment with your favorite Aspi tribute because he's recently renewed and is club vice captain and is generally awesome. And then use the hashtag London is Blue 1M. So London is Blue 1 million. And you'll be entered to win this thing. It is for US fans only. So sorry to Joe who can't enter, unfortunately, for this wonderful kit. But we just want to say we just want to say thanks to Classic Football Shirts, and then obviously to all of you for helping us kind of get over this major milestone. We started this 4 years ago, 4 years ago and change, and never in my wildest dreams thought we'd ever cross 1 million all-time downloads. So for that and for so much more, just a huge thank you.
All right, well, we'll keep the celebration going. We'll try to keep the mood high as we go through Chelsea's current squad and kind of taking this information in, soaking it up, understanding that there may be a transfer ban. It may involve multiple windows. We have an existing squad of players, and a couple of them have already made contract extensions. We've seen Marcus Alonso sign an extension. N'Golo Kante obviously signed a massive extension to make him the highest wage earner at the club. We saw Azpilicueta resign. There's rumors of Rudiger resigning, but we have a lot of players who are potentially going to be out of contract in the very near future. We also have a lot of other players who are on extended contracts, like Jorginho, Kepa, Ampadu, Barkley. There's individuals. So we do have players that would be able to help us fill out a lineup, Joe. But where is your primary concern looking at maybe what's kind of about to expire right now? Are there players that we should be locking up for another year or two, considering this potential ban, that have not signed one yet?
I think probably with my academy bias hat slight on here, I think you're looking at, probably Hudson-Odoi and Loftus-Cheek. Hudson-Odoi's contract, I think, expires in 2020 and Rubin's does in 2021. So it's not a huge kind of amount of time left, particularly with Hudson-Odoi, and there's obviously a lot of interest in him at the moment in terms of other clubs trying to sort of swoop in and take him. But I think, you're looking first of all kind of at trying to maintain some of the kind of club trained players. Obviously, a lot of this homegrown stuff is going to be particularly important, particularly if Brexit goes through. So if it does eventually go through, I think we need to acknowledge that there's going to be some sort of implications on how squads are composed going forward. So we need to retain or make a real effort to retain as many of our homegrown club trained players as possible, players who have come through the academy in that respect. So I think that definitely does become important. But looking at sort of expiring contracts, I think probably the one that kind of jumps out probably is David Luiz. More so, I would say, for his leadership. I think he has the character that's probably needed around the club, in the dressing room. I still don't see a huge amount of leaders within the sort of the dressing room per se. Fabregas, I think, potentially wants to play regularly. There has been a lot of interest in him from AC Milan historically, but obviously now that he can leave on a 3, I think that obviously is going to also come into play. But looking at sort of some of the older players who are leaving, I think really it's Luiz. And actually, looking at the graphic you've got there, Bulka, I think him leaving, Kepa maybe has kind of blocked his possibility of ever being the club's number 1, but that is an incredibly talented young goalkeeper to let go for next to nothing. So, there hasn't been a lot of noise around him signing a contract, and I would say that's probably because he feels, and probably quite rightfully, that he could start for probably a Premier League team within the next 1 to 2 years. Probably start abroad, and I think he could be a number 1 goalkeeper before he's 20. So, or if he's definitely within the next sort of 1 to 2 years. But that would be an interesting one to lose, because I think, again, you look at sort of the standard of goalkeeping globally, and I think Bulka's very talented, but you're losing him for nothing, which again kind of goes against Chelsea's whole business model of finding young talented players and then looking to sort of sell some of them on for a decent profit. So he's also quite an interesting one. And then obviously Hazard obviously jumps off the page as well. Part of me thinks that he's not going to sign the contract that's on the table. The other half of me hopefully hopes that he looks at what's going on at Real Madrid at the moment and feels, that this isn't necessarily a place that he wants to go. Hopefully that he can remain at Chelsea. But I think that's kind of down to the club. If we qualify for the Champions League and we're able to, let's say, get 1 or 2 decent players in to help support him, I think he could stay. But again, you're looking at losing another player for potentially well below their sort of current market value. So there's a couple that stand out. I think a lot of the sort of squad fillers / dead weight players are kind of coming towards the end of their kind of contracts. So that's not the end of the world. Obviously, the fact we won't be getting any money from them is a bit problematic, but I think, Hazard is obviously the one that jumps off the page, and then you're looking at some of the more younger, homegrown players to sort of fill in those gaps that I think are going to need to be filled probably from next year onwards.
So, Nick, I'm looking at the list, so we'll kind of run through it here too for players that are out of contract as of 2019, 2020. So essentially at the end of this season, they're going to be able to do whatever they want. They could be re-signed. They could, start in January talking to teams and get a pre-contract going. But that is Cesc Fabregas, Willy Caballero, Mateo Kovacic goes back to Real Madrid, ends his loan, Olivier Giroud. We have Gary Cahill, David Luiz, the one and only Rob Green, and Lucas Paisan and Marcin Bolka. So I know that, we obviously talked about David Luiz, as Joe's kind of highlighting, probably needs a 1-year contract extension, whether he will or won't sign it. That's another scenario to consider. But are you seeing any players there that you have grown attached to or fond of that you would probably be looking to throw a 1-year deal on the table and see what happens?
Well, I think the interesting one would be Giroud to me, because I frankly don't know where the club is going to go from a striking perspective. I mean, if Morata is the one that's kind of being dangled out there because he's younger and there's always the prospect for him to kind of find his feet somewhere else, then that leaves us with Giroud right now on the bench, and I guess Hazard if they're going to continue with this kind of false nine striker scenario. So that's really interesting to me that you might be able to just re-up him for another year until you figure it out. But with the ban looming, I'm not sure that that's even a great long-term option. So yeah, the striking scenario is bleak right now, to say the least, Joe. And if Batshuayi comes back, I mean he's still pretty young. Tammy Abraham's out there, but I'm not sure he's Premier League quality. There are not a ton of options to be found, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean I think the huge issue we have, and I think we're seeing it this season, is it's not just the fact that we don't have a centre forward who kind of knows where the goal is regularly. And when you're trying to bed in new tactics, I think one of the things that people often overlook, and this kind of goes up when you've got players like Aguero and Harry Kane and obviously in the league, having a really good striker who can just score from nothing really does paper over a lot of the cracks today. And, I know we're not talking about today's game, but I don't think we played particularly well. But one half of Eden Hazard playing pretty much at his full capacity and the game was won. We don't have really enough of those kind of attacking players, definitely not a forward or a winger like Salah who can just bang in, sort of 20, 30 goals to paper over the cracks. I think while he's rebuilding, he virtually, or the team has to virtually be perfect every single game for us to win. And whereas, you could probably go back to and look at some of Tottenham's results, under Pochettino and sort of Aguero at City. And sometimes they don't play particularly well, but then Aguero will just pop up with 2 goals, or Harry Kane will just score, 2 absolute screamers. And that's it, 3 points. And, you can't really underestimate the value of just having that type of player in the squad. And as you say, when you look internally at the moment, I really like him as a hold-up player, but he's never going to be a 20-goal-a-season striker. Morata, I kind of was not hugely in favour of signing him to begin with, and the more I see him play, the less confidence I have in him as a forward. Batshuayi, for some reason, never really seems to get a chance here. Good finisher, but you have to kind of wonder why he's not been considered by Sarri, given we had so few options. And I kind of agree on Tammy Abraham. He's sort of this kind of weird situation where he's probably too good for the Championship, but maybe at the moment he needs to find a lower team in the Premier League where he's going to kind of get adapted to Premier League football. Because, having him coming and be Chelsea's number 1 striker is, it's a roll of the dice. It's not anything that's going to confirm that's really going to sort of get us to where we need to be in terms of having that sort of prolific centre forward. So we go back to sort of the January window and who potentially is someone that we can bring in there, because if we're looking at this ban for, let's say, multiple windows, if we can't find a striker in this sort of upcoming January, then it's going to be Morata and Batshuayi and Giroud maybe for the next 2, probably the next season and a half potentially. So yeah, it's definitely problematic, but something the club absolutely has to find the answer to, and it probably has to be this January.
Well, we will, in the second part of this two-part Winter Wonder Transferland special, we will go into specific strikers. But I think as we kind of also talk about attack, we have Willian out of contract in 2020 and Pedro out of contract in 2020. I think, Joe, you were kind of also highlighting the fact that one of the two is probably gone at some point here, because obviously we need some level of maybe just, rotational play. And obviously I think Pedro, in my mind, is the one that fits Sarri's system just a touch better than Willian, even though Willian getting to play on the left-hand side is definitely more special than him getting to play on the right-hand side. So the Hazard, Pedro, Willian scenario actually works out, I think, pretty well for all parties involved. But do you see, it seems to me like Willian is the one who wants more playing time and also has been courted by bigger teams recently than Pedro, even though Willian is getting a little bit older. Would you see the club maybe trying to find a way to, if there is one last window, know that they potentially can get some level of revenue for him and ship him away so we could bring in someone a little bit younger?
I think if they wanted to sell him, they probably would have done it in the summer. I still think turning down, 50-60 million pounds for him from Barcelona, I still think that was an incredible decision that the club made at the time. I don't think this is a guy who, I don't think has he broken double figures in the league since he's been here? I'm not sure if he has.
No, the answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk about all of the work rate and the balancing of the team and the foil for Hazard and all of this stuff that people say to justify him playing the amount of games that he has. But in a team that doesn't have goals, I would swap him for a lazy, greedy right winger who gets 20, 25 goals a season, within a heartbeat. So I think they've maybe missed out on that opportunity to get some decent money for him. But I think potentially, what you're saying in terms of him and Pedro to me looks a better fit, both in that he can probably also play down the middle, as well as sort of playing from the right in a slightly more kind of fluid fashion than Willian can. I would see potentially that he goes in the summer. I know the club would probably obviously like to renew him and maybe use that as an ability to generate some sort of money from him. But, Willian leaving now or leaving in the summer, it's probably going to be his last big contract that he gets, whether that's in China or maybe he'll look into Barcelona and all summer in Spain. But I see him being the player that goes and Chelsea looking to get someone in to replace him.
And Nick, I know that you are potentially deeply saddened by the fact that Zappacosta's contract runs out in 2021.
Man.
You're a huge fan.
Really
love the right wing back position. Him and Moses actually both subject to a 2021 end of contract. And, I would imagine those are probably players that don't have a long shelf life either.
Yeah, I mean, Moses and Zappacosta are probably, I would say, most likely to be transferred sooner rather than later. There's all this speculation now around, whether, Aspi stays as right back, if he moves around maybe to a left back, or if he plays in the center because we can't find a stable option next to Rudiger. There's a lot to be considered there. I think Moses, is kind of from a fit standpoint, obviously needs to go play as a wing back now, and that's just not the role that Sarri's going to ever be able to offer him. So that's unfortunate because he's a guy who I really liked under Antonio Conte. Zappacosta just isn't ever going to do it for me, unfortunately, and that's just a personal opinion on that. And then Ruben in 2021, as Joe said recently on the show, it's maybe this transfer ban is the best thing that could potentially happen for his career at Chelsea. I think he's starting to grow into Sarri's system. He's certainly a threat moving forward, and some of his ball control, is just insane for how big and strong he is. So he's a guy who I think every Chelsea fan is, in addition to Hudson-Odoi, we're all rooting for, to re-sign a long-term contract and to really have a great shot in the team, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think people know that I have a slight bias towards any of the academy players coming through that are pretty decent. But I think what's really pleased me about Loftus-Cheek this season is that he has taken a challenge from a manager, but a manager who actually seemingly wants to kind of improve him. rather than a challenge of just, okay, we're going to put you as a centre forward or we'll play you on the wing and just sort of forget about you. He's kind of taken the challenge of getting better and performing better. And we are seeing, I think, this season, probably, he's put in some really, really good performances in the Chelsea shirt. There's still obviously things that he needs to get better at, but I think that's probably the case for a lot of the players under Sarri. But, he's gone from being someone with potential who is slowly starting to realise that now. And I still think people will always have to factor in that he hasn't played the amount of football that he probably should have at his age. So he's always going to be a little bit behind certain things in terms of his curve. But I think, what he brings, particularly with the ball at his feet, I think what you're saying is right there, is that, there aren't many players in European football who have his combination of technical ability plus physical prowess, his power when he gets up and running with the ball, but it's also his end product, his feet, the way that he's kind of like a big Hazard sometimes when he runs with the ball. And it's a very strange kind of idea that someone that big can be that nimble and have that kind of low centre of gravity. But we're starting to see him, and I think when he came on today, he was also very good. But I think Hudson-Odoi is the one for me that I'm really also hopeful that the club can resolve his contract situation, because again, I think if Eden does leave, and I'm not by any means putting pressure on Hudson-Odoi by saying that he's a replacement, but he is potentially someone who could replace Hazard, and maybe not in the world-class player straight away kind of sort of way that Hazard would leave quite a big hole there, but probably with goals and assists. Hudson-Odoi is a lot more direct than Hazard. He's a lot more direct than pretty much everyone else that we have, who plays in that particular kind of wide areas up front. So, yeah, I'd love to see both of them kind of renew and also kind of stay around with the club. And yeah, I mean, going back to the point about Moses and Zappacosta, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Moses goes in January, Crystal Palace or Fulham, someone like that, and also Zappacosta potentially back to Italy. Also very interesting to note that obviously in terms of right backs, we have Reece James, who's doing very, very well at Wigan, and then Ola Aina, who has completely kind of found himself playing in Serie A this season. He's been a bit of a revelation for Torino. So yeah, both of them are doing very, very well and could also come back in the summer and potentially have arguments to start playing for Chelsea. So yeah, it's a question of trying to get the better younger players signed up for longer term deals. I think obviously the transfer ban is one thing, but also this whole Brexit scenario potentially is another thing as well that the club need to be, well, I assume that they are mindful of, but I think that they also obviously, as fans, we need to be mindful that there potentially is going to be some issues in signing sort of overseas players or something like that post Brexit. So yeah, they need to have a bit more of a focus domestically, but I'd be very, very happy if both Hudson-Odoi and Loftus-Cheek extended.
All right. Well, I think we have talked this part of the podcast to its natural end. And all we would ask of you all is if you have any thoughts around which players should get an extension, which players you're thinking probably are going to leave in January, leave in the summer. Hit us up on Instagram, on Twitter, send us an email, hit us up on Patreon, let us know what you're thinking, because obviously the conversation is a good, fun one to have, and it will definitely keep you occupied maybe during those awkward moments when family stuff is going on during the holiday season, and, Uncle Nick has had a little too much to drink, a little too much Four Roses.
Come on.
And, you just don't want to have that conversation about politics or sports or religion.
You've made Nick sound like the creepy uncle.
Yeah, man. What do I do to deserve this?
Sorry. We'll make it Brandon because he's not here. Yeah. It'll be creepy Brandon, your Uncle Brandon.
He can't defend himself. That's how we like to do insults on this show.
All right. Well, we will hit you back on Wednesday. So it's Tuesday. You're hearing this today. We'll hit you back on Wednesday with another episode. Joe will be back, and we'll go into specific players, other winter transfer kind of options that might be out there, and answer some of the questions we got on social media. But until we do that, the last thing we'd say is, you know what to do, Chelsea fans. Keep the blue flag flying high.